Well, a warm welcome to this podcast on the subject of hypoxia, wherever and whenever you are listening. Now, hypoxia means a deficiency of oxygen in the tissues of the body. We're talking about the level of the tissues here. And the term is in contrast to hypoxemia, which means a deficiency of oxygen in the blood. A-E-M-I-A, emia always means in the blood. So hypoxia is deficiency of oxygen at the level of the tissues. Hypoxemia, deficiency of oxygen in the blood. And another term people sometimes use is anoxia. A-N begins with an. So anoxia technically means with no oxygen at all. And that's unlikely to happen in physiological situations. I suppose if there was a complete necrotic infarct, the conditions might be quite anoxic. But generally the term hypoxia is the preferred one, a deficiency of oxygen. Now oxygen, of course, is essential for the production of energy. Oxygen is used in the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cells, located in the cytosol of the cells. And the oxygen breaks down fuel molecules. So in the mitochondria, oxygen combines with fuel molecules. And what the oxygen does is it breaks down the fuel molecule into simpler constituents. Now let's take the simplest fuel molecule, which would be glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. And that glucose molecule was put together inside a plant. And what the plant did was the plant combined water and carbon dioxide to make the glucose. And the energy, of course, came from the sun, from photosynthesis. So the sun put the energy in, and the energy is stored in the chemical bonds that hold the atoms of the glucose molecule together. And when that molecule is oxidized in the mitochondria, that energy, which was put there in the process of photosynthesis from the sunlight, is released. And that energy is released inside the mitochondria. And what the mitochondria do is the mitochondria take a molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and they add a phosphate unit and make it adenosine triphosphate. It turns it from ADP into ATP. And that extra phosphate unit is attached onto the ADP molecule to make it ATP by using quite a lot of energy. It's an energy-rich bond. And what that means is that there's now an energy-rich molecule, ATP, in the cell. And that can go to parts of the cell where the energy is required. And when energy is required in physiological reactions, the ATP is reconverted to ADP, liberating the phosphate unit, but more importantly in this context, liberating the energy which that bond contained. So it becomes the energy currency of the cell. So oxygen is absolutely vital for that. And in atmospheric air on our planet at the moment, despite the best efforts of humans to reduce it by using too much oxygen in fossil fuels and things like that, but there's still about 20.84%, just under 21%, 20.84% oxygen in the air. And oxygen can't be stored in any substantial way in the body tissues. So we always need a constant supply, because without the oxygen, the energy in the cell will run out pretty quickly, and without the energy there can be no fueling of biochemical processes. And it's the biochemical processes which give rise to the physiological processes, the processes of life. So it's all quite essential on an ongoing basis. And this was put beautifully by an English medical researcher called J.S. Haldane. He died way back in 1936. But he said this. Listen to this. This is the best concise statement probably that I've ever heard in physiology. He said, oxygen lack not only stops the machine, but wrecks the machinery. He was actually talking about the brain, because the brain is the most sensitive organ to oxygen lack. If there's an oxygen lack, it will stop the machine, it will stop it from working, but then it will go on and wreck the machinery. There will be irreversible damage, irreversible hypoxic damage. He could have put it this way, not that I'm advising him what to say, but he could have put oxygen lack first stops the machine and then goes on to wreck the machinery. Anyway, he said oxygen lack not only stops the machine but wrecks the machinery. It will stop it working and then it will damage it. So just why is it that hypoxia is so devastating to tissues? Why is hypoxia so damaging? Well, first of all, the lack of oxygen means the physiological processes are going to stop. And of course that means eventually that life is going to stop. Death, I suppose, could be described as an absence of physiology. In fact, that's not a bad definition of death when you think about it. And if there's no physiology, there's no life. And oxygen is necessary to fuel the processes of life. But specifically, what's happening? Well, you might remember that there's two sorts of metabolism, two ways that cells can make energy. Remember those? Do you remember that the cells can make energy with oxygen, and for a period of time they can make energy without oxygen? And when the cell makes energy with oxygen, that's called aerobic metabolism, in the presence of oxygen. And when the cell makes energy, as it can do for a period of time, in the absence or in reduced levels of oxygen, that's called anaerobic metabolism, energy production without oxygen. But the problem is, when the cells produce energy in the absence of oxygen, for biochemical reasons, the biochemical pathways aren't complete, and lactic acid is produced as a waste product. And of course lactic acid is just that, it is an acid. So as lactic acid accumulates in the cells and tissues, that's going to reduce the pH. The pH is going to go down and the conditions are going to become more acidic. Now, all the biochemical processes going on inside cells depend on the presence of intracellular enzymes to catalyze the biochemical reactions. And enzymes only work in very specific ranges of temperature and pH. So if the pH becomes a little bit more acidic, enzymes will stop working a lot. So a relatively small amount of increased acidity can stop the enzymes working quite significantly as the conditions become more acidic. And the lack of energy inside the cell means that the sodium-potassium pumps on the cell membrane are no longer able to pump out sodium ions. Now, if these pumps on the cell membranes are no longer able to pump out sodium ions from the cytosol of the cell into the tissue fluid, what is that going to do to the amount of sodium ions in the intracellular fluid? Well, if they're not being pumped out, the amount of sodium ions in the cells are going to increase. And sodium is an osmotic molecule. It will attract water. So the water will be sucked into the cells. And if there's more and more water going into the cells are going to swell. And the cells themselves will swell, and components inside the cell will also swell. The mitochondria themselves will swell. The endoplasmic reticulum will swell. And the cell is in danger of being damaged by the swelling. But at this stage, if the hypoxia is corrected because you clear the patient's airway, or you start the patient breathing, or you give the patient adequate amounts of oxygen, or you do whatever it is necessary to treat that hypoxia, then at the swollen cell stage, the hypoxia is reversible. So, when you detect a hypoxic patient, correct it as rapidly as possible. And the tissue insult, the abnormal tissues, can heal. There can be reversal of the hypoxic process, up to a point. But eventually, what will happen is that the swelling will affect the lysosomes inside the cytosol of the cell. Now, do you remember the lysosomes? The lysosomes contain lysozyme, which is a digestive enzyme. And if the lysosomes burst as a result of hypoxic injury, that will release the lysozyme into the cell. And because the lysozyme is a digestive enzyme, of course that cell's just going to be auto-digested. That will be dead, irreversible tissue damage as a result of the hypoxia. So, remember that early hypoxia is completely reversible. Late hypoxia is not. It's critical that you intervene to oxygenate your patient on time. Now, I think the next thing to do is look at the classifications of hypoxia. But before we do that, I just want to go back and do a little more physiology on oxygen. And if you've got one of the black pathophysiology notes books, turn to the hypoxia chapter, and you'll see a diagram there on the oxygen pathway. Because what happens is there's oxygen in the air, which is fine, but where do we actually need the oxygen? Well, the oxygen is needed by the mitochondria. So we've got to get the oxygen from the air into the mitochondria in individual billions of cells. How do we get it there? Well, the oxygen's got to follow a pathway. So first of all, there has to be action of the chest wall. The intercostal muscles need to contract. The external intercostal muscles contract. And when the external intercostal muscles contract, what does this do to the chest wall? Well, it pulls it up and it pulls it out. And at the same time, the phrenic nerves are going to stimulate the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is going to contract. And when the diaphragm contracts, what does it do when the diaphragm contracts? Well, when the diaphragm contracts, it goes down, it flattens. So the ribs move up and out, the diaphragm moves down. That is going to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now, if you increase the volume, what are you going to do to the pressure? Well, if you increase the volume, the pressure is going to be reduced. So the ribs going up and out, the diaphragm goes down, that increases the volume, that reduces the intrathoracic pressure. That means that the pressure in the outside air is now higher than the pressure inside the lungs, inside the thoracic cavity. That means air is going to be sucked into the lungs. And this must work, that this mechanism must be functional, because we are negative pressure ventilators. We generate a negative pressure inside the thoracic cavity, and that sucks air into our lungs. That is what our normal ventilation absolutely depends on. But then, of course, the bronchial passages need to be patent. There needs to be wide bronchial passages. First the trachea, then the right and left main bronchus, then lobar bronchi and the segmental bronchi, and then all the way down to the level of the bronchioles, the microscopic airways. They all have to be patent to let the air go through. And then the air's got to go into the alveoli, into the actual air sacs. And then the oxygen needs to diffuse into the fluid which lines the alveoli. It needs to diffuse through the fluid, through the cells of the alveoli, and then through the endothelial cells of the pulmonary capillaries, which of course surround the alveoli. The pulmonary capillaries completely surround the alveoli. It's almost as if there's a sheet of blood, really, completely surrounding it. So there's a large surface area. The surface area in the alveoli, if you're young and healthy, you've got about 70 plus 72 square meters of alveolar surface area in each lung. Quite a few textbooks get this wrong, actually. It's irritating. A lot of textbooks say that the 70 square meters of internal surface area inside the lungs. There's not the 70 square meters per lung. That's over 140 square meters in both lungs. So if someone gets that wrong, make sure you correct them. It's 140 square meters in healthy lungs. So the oxygen's got to go through the alveoli, through the endothelial cells of the pulmonary capillaries, and then of course most of it about 98 or 99% of the oxygen carried in the blood is carried in the hemoglobin of the red blood cells, of the erythrocytes. So these erythrocytes must be present and they must be healthy. Then the blood's got to circulate around the body in an adequately functioning circulatory system. The blood's got to go from the lungs. When the blood drains from the lungs, it drains into 4 large pulmonary veins. Now, which chamber of the heart do the pulmonary veins drain into? Well, the pulmonary veins will drain into the left atrium, won't they? The left atrium. The blood will then go through the bicuspid or the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, ejecting the blood through the aortic valve into the aorta. The aorta will take the blood to all the systemic arteries in the body, and that will take the blood into the arterioles, and that will take the blood into all of the systemic capillaries. So that circulatory system needs to be functioning, and it needs to be patent. Then the oxygen will arrive in the red cells in the systemic capillaries of the body. Then the oxygen has got to diffuse from the red cells back through the endothelial cells of the capillary. Well, not back through, I suppose. They did go through in the lungs, but now they're going through the systemic ones. So the oxygen's in the red cells and the capillaries. It's got to diffuse from the red cells and the capillaries through the endothelial cells of the systemic capillaries, and that will take it into the interstitial fluids, or the tissue fluids which surround the cells. So the oxygen must then diffuse through that tissue fluid. Then the oxygen must diffuse into the cells, and only then can it get into the mitochondria. And the equation that produces the energy in the mitochondria, if we take the example of glucose, is glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide plus water plus this energy that we talked about at the start of this talk. And that equation has a particular name. What do we call this equation? Well, this equation is actually called respiration. I know some textbooks will call it internal respiration, but this is the actual equation of respiration. This is the way oxygen is used in the body, and that is the whole purpose, to get the oxygen to these mitochondria so that the energy can be produced.